that starts really quick.
Call the meeting of the Amherst City Council to order, regular meeting on January 28th, 2019 at 7 p.m. Roll call, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Here.
Mr. Nahorn?
Present.
Mr. Heberling?
Present.
Mr. Janik?
Here.
Mr. Van Turen?
Here.
Mr. Dembinski?
Here.
Mr. Cowger?
Here.
Mr. Patak has a letter. Mr. Cowger.
Make a motion to excuse Mr. Patak from tonight's meeting. He has a letter on file.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to excuse Mr. Patak from the meeting tonight. He has a letter on file. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion is carried 7-0. Mr. Patak is excused tonight. We will go now to the prayer led by Chaplain Nahorn and followed by the pledge to the flag by Sergeant at Arms Dembinski.
Join me in bowing your heads. Gracious God, during this month we especially remember the impactful words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who once stated, "The time is always right to do what's right." Please continue to guide us and let us always remember to do what is right for our town. And now let the words of our mouths and meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your vision. Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Go to item 4 on the agenda, the consent agenda.
Minutes of the regular council meeting held January 14th, 2019. Minutes of the Streets Committee meeting held January 22nd, 2019. Minutes of the Finance Committee meeting held January 22nd, 2019. Minutes of the Special Finance Committee meeting held January 28th, 2019.
Mr. Van Truen.
Move to accept the consent agenda as read.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to accept the consent agenda as read. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion is carried 7-0. The consent agenda is accepted. Now we will go on to item 5 on the agenda, acknowledgement of the public pertaining to items on the agenda. Is there anyone wishing to speak tonight on any of the items on the agenda? Seeing no one wishing to speak, we will go to item 6, ordinances and resolutions, first reading. Item 6A, please.
An ordinance to perform guardrail upgrades on SLM 24.31 to SLM 24.67 on State Route 0058 in the city of Amherst in Lorraine County.
Mr. Winarski.
Thank you, Madam President. We need the emergency attached to this, don't we?
Emergency and suspension rules, if you could, just so ODOT could get on with their business. But I did call down there, and they talked about that FHWA that you asked about.
Yeah.
He said you could pass it on as it is. It's not that big a deal. It's just a typing error. But they did send a revised copy of it today, so I'll make sure I insert that
Oh, thanks for
when
mentioning
this all gets
I
signed.
appreciate it. Thank you. That's all. Well, I guess before I say that's all, I'll make the motion to suspend council rules so this can be passed on the first reading.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
There's a motion and a second that requires, to suspend the rule that requires 3 readings so that this can be passed on the first reading. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Heberling?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries 7-0. That rule is suspended. Mr. Cowger.
Move to adopt.
Mr. Janik.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to adopt. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Heberling?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. Is
Yep.
adopted.
It'll be ordinance 01904.
Item 6B, please.
An ordinance authorizing and directing the Safety Service Director to solicit bids to trim trees on a unit basis in the city for the year 2019 at a cost not to exceed $80,000, and authorizing and directing the Safety Service Director to award the contract for such work to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Dembinski.
Move to suspend council rules so that item 6B may be passed on the first reading.
Thank you. Mr. Cowger.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to suspend the rule that requires 3 readings so that item 6B can be adopted on the first reading. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Haberling?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries 7-0. That rule is suspended. Mr. Janik.
Move to adopt.
Mr. Cowger.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to adopt. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Haberling?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries 7-0. That rule is adopted.
You'll be ordinance 01905.
Item 6C, please.
An ordinance to appropriate funds for the City of Amherst share of the Cooper Foster Park Road reconstruction project between State Route 58 and Oberlin Avenue, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Janik.
I can make a motion to suspend council rules so that item 6C can be passed on the first reading.
Thank you. Mr. Winarski.
I'll second.
There's a motion and a second to suspend the rule that requires 3 readings so that item 6C can be passed on the first reading. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Haberling?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski.
Motion to adopt.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to adopt. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Haberling?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries 7-0. That ordinance is adopted.
You'll be ordinance 01906.
Item 6D, please.
An ordinance adopting a written policy for the use of credit card accounts and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Dembinski.
Moves to suspend council rules so that item 6D may be passed on the first reading.
Thank you, Mr. Cowger.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to suspend the rule that requires 3 readings so that item 6D can be passed on the first reading. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Haberling?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. That rule is suspended. Mr. Janik.
Move to adopt.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second as amended.
Mr. Janik, that's as amended, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. There's a motion and a second to adopt item 6D as amended. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Haberling?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. That ordinance is adopted.
You'll be ordinance 01907.
We'll go on to item 7, ordinances and resolutions, second reading. There are none. We will go on to item 8, ordinances and resolutions, third reading. There are none. Item 9, miscellaneous and acknowledgement of the public. Mr. Nahorn.
Yes, please. Thank you, Madam President. Just wanted to provide a brief bit of information. I was pleased to have had the opportunity to attend the public meeting on the Cooper Foster Park Road improvements between 58 and Oberlin Avenue. That actually work has begun already now, but the meeting was last week, public meeting at Lorraine High School. Just a couple points that I wanted to bring up. They mentioned that the eastbound traffic will be maintained during the project. Something I was really excited about hearing about the new storm sewers that they've planned to enlarge them and to make sure that they're all connected properly. I know there's been some issues in that area, and hopefully that'll reduce some of the flooding that we've been seeing there. And the project manager did make clear, and I put a few notes here just to remind myself, that they do have a good understanding of the fact of the businesses and the homeowners and residents, their concerns of access during this project. And of course, that was one of the main concerns. But the project manager is very well aware of that, and I just wanted to make a few comments on all of that. And this project, as I said, the work has begun, and looking forward to the completion near the end of the year. But again, very pleased that this finally has come to fruition. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nahorn. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak on any subject? Seeing no one wishing to speak further, we will go on to item 10, agenda requests and committee meeting schedules. Madam Clerk?
This was added after the last council meeting. It was A1909. It was in finance, an ordinance adopting the credit card policy with the city of Amherst in compliance with House Bill 312. New ones are finance, A1910, ordinance to make appropriations for current expenses and other expenditures of the city of Amherst, state of Ohio during the fiscal year ending December 31st, 2019, repealing all ordinances in conflict herewith. And to finance, A1911, authorization to bid and award the 2019 Streets Rehabilitation Program. That's all I have, Madam President.
Thank you very much. Finance Committee, Mr. Cowger.
Yes, I'd like to call the Finance Committee meeting for next Monday at 7, 2 items, A1910 as read, and A1911 as read. And that is complete.
Thank you. Building and Lands, Mr. Winarski.
Nothing at this time, Madam President.
Thank you. Streets, Mr. Van Truen.
No items, please cancel.
Thank you. Community Development, Mr. Nahorn.
No items, please cancel.
Executive, Mr. Van Truen.
No items at this time, please cancel.
Thank you. Ordinance, Mr. Dembinski.
I have no new items at this time, Madam President, but I would like to remind council that we have A-1905, an ordinance to approve updated standing rules of council called for next Monday. We will have that after finance.
Thank you. Is that complete?
Yes, that is all. Thank you.
Thank you. Utilities, Mr. Janik.
No items, Madam President, please cancel.
Recycle, Mr. Nahorn.
Please keep recycling.
Technology, Mr. Dembinski.
No items at this time, Madam President. Please cancel.
Police and Fire, Mr. Winarski.
Nothing at this time, Madam President.
Thank you. Annexation, Mr. Van Truen.
No items, Madam President, please cancel. Cancel it.
Thank you. That completes agenda requests and committee meeting schedules. We'll go to item 11, reports of the administration. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Pecora. Just one item on February 16th, the law department's going to sponsor a free probate and estate planning seminar at Main Street. Starts at 8:30 in the morning, a little early, but Judge Walther of our probate court in Lorraine County will be presenting first, as well as Russ McLaughlin, who's my partner, and Bernadette Matheson as well, will be on hand to provide any knowledge that you want to know about probate and estate planning and trusts and wills and Medicare and all that good stuff. So I want to thank Judge Walther for coming and spending time with our community, and we're all welcome to be there. So that's it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Ramsey.
No report this evening, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Jeffries.
No report, Mr. Mayor, thank you.
Thank you.
Just one quick note, the new cameras have been up and running now, and the link to view those is available on the city's website, right on the
front, there's a little link you can hook onto. And I do believe soon, if not now, the availability watching it live is there now. So start passing that around. Hopefully we'll have some public awareness of that, and maybe even do a little video or something on the TV channel, how to get on that link and view it. The agendas are available. There's little links with each part of the meeting. You can click and go to right little tidbits of things that you're actually interested in listening to. So it's quite an improvement, so check it out. In report.
Thank you very much. Mr. Calgar.
Make a motion to accept the reports of the administration.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second?
There's a motion and a second to accept the reports of the administration. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion carried 7-0. The reports of the administration are accepted. Mr. Dembinski.
Move to adjourn.
Mr. Calgar.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion carries 7-0. We are adjourned at 7:19 p.m. Thank you.
Mark, you got about 5 minutes to chat with me. Chat with the man.